Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Larry Scogan. It's my good fortune to be president of Bismarck State College, and I certainly want to welcome all of you to our conference. I think we're at about 5 for this year, something like that, conversations we've had. I actually have it someplace. But at any rate, we're just delighted to have all of you here, and we're glad that the storm didn't come today. We had a pretty good storm there, so it was. I'm glad that it happened when it happened, and that gave us 48 hours to get dug out, and it's rather nice out today. So, so at any rate, we're looking forward to a great conversation. As we do, sometimes I give a too long introduction to my good friend here, but today I'll just say, please welcome Clay Jenkinson to our stage. How's that?
Good.
A couple of administrative notes to begin with. Again, we certainly appreciate the following that we get in these conversations, and we actually have the list for next year. And you haven't seen this?
No, you.
It's a surprise.
Oh, good.
And so on your way out, if you haven't picked one up on your way in, please pick one up, and we've got all the dates scheduled and an agenda all set up for next year. Also, as you know, the North Dakota Humanities Council for the Humanities helps fund this series, and as a result, we have a requirement to turn in evaluations. So if you have anything to say, please mark it on here. We'd appreciate getting evaluations. If you got any comments you got any ideas of talks you'd like us to have, please put those down. Any suggestions for improvement, if you like what we're doing and you want us to do more of it or whatever, please let us know, because we certainly do. Robin does a great job of collating all of this and getting us this information, so we really do take it very, very seriously. So please take time to do that. The other handout that you should have before we get into the topic here is a brief Cold War timeline, and it is brief. We're going to be talking about things today, I think, Clay, that aren't on the list because there's so much. The Cold War is such an important part of our modern history, our contemporary history, and so there's going to be a lot of things, but it gives you a rough outline of what transpired during the Cold War a little bit, and you can kind of follow along with us as we talk today. Now, what I find most interesting, Clay, I guess, is we're just going to go ahead and get started, unless you want to say something else before you ready? Okay. What I do want to talk about is that this topic of nuclear power all of a sudden became in the last 48 hours not just an academic conversation. We're now in the atomic/nuclear age. We know that. I go to a lot of energy conferences, and over the last couple of years, nuclear power has become the darling, if you will, of so many people that are concerned about renewables and clean energy and so on. And Clay, the thing I've been hearing...
Post-carbon. I mean, all the people who are anxious about carbon have believed that nuclear power is one really important element of a post-carbon world.
Exactly.
And then, of course, what happened this weekend in Japan almost certainly represents a profound setback for that point of view.
So what we thought we would do is start off with just a little bit of conversation here about what's going on there, and hear some of Clay's thoughts about the future of that industry as we move forward and what's going on. So you tell me when to switch slides, and I'll do that.
Let's just move forward to...
Yeah.
Well, can I just say something
Capitalize on the rank there.
I mean, one of let me just talk for just a second about how much fun this is. Because when Larry first suggested that I do this, I said, I'm not doing it unless they're true conversations and we're both up there and we choose topics together. And I'm fascinated by the history. As a North Dakotan, I'm fascinated by the history of the militarization of North Dakota, going back to, I suppose, to Lewis and Clark, but certainly the forts and the presence of the U.S. Army and the cavalry here in the mid-century of the 19th century as the American West was pacified of Indian resistance. And then after World War II, there's a long history during World War I and between the two wars too, but after World War II, North Dakota became one of the front lines of the Cold War. And there's a very interesting history of that, so I'm fascinated by this because it's a little bit odd to think that here's North Dakota with 672,000 people, and it was arguably one of the most important front lines of the Cold War, there's a paradox there, particularly given the fact that we are historically an agrarian Jeffersonian state, and the agrarian has usually been at odds with the military model of the world. So that's always fascinated me. And then when I met you, I didn't know this until we had lunch, but you were not only in the U.S. Air Force, but you were a missileer. Can you explain what that is?
Well, actually, I was going to talk about it as we got further.
You can at least introduce it.
You want to? Okay, all right. Well, I did. I started my career in the Air Force as an enlisted guy, and really enjoyed that part of it. But I found out that I could make a lot more money if I had a commission, and so the avenue that was open to me was, at that time, was going into ICBMs as a Minuteman missile launcher. Intercontinental ballistic missile officer.
I'll try to be his D-jargon guy here.
And so I did that. I ended up, I applied to Officers Training School and then to get into ICBMs. And I spent 4 years on crew in Missouri at Whiteman Air Force Base. And then later on, I did a lot of other things in between, but I ended my career on a missile base in F.E. Warren.
In Wyoming.
In Wyoming.
And you actually then spent time down in the
yes
command centers. And
well, yes. Launch control centers, they're called. And we're going to talk about that. We're going to have a little dive.
So you have, my point is, you have some actual knowledge. I'm just making it up, but you know what you're talking about.
Okay.
And you were, in some sense, you were a Cold Warrior. You were part of the Cold War, right?
That's true. That's true.
So that gives you, I mean, that's really an interesting perspective that probably not everybody knew. So okay. Let's quickly move forward to Japan just for a moment. So what I heard the other day, go one more. All right, let's leave it at there for the moment. But I was watching CNN like everybody else. I mean, whenever you think that television doesn't matter, something like the earthquake in Japan happens, and then you realize immediately why it's so important, the medium. But I was watching a man who is the head of the Plowshares Group. The Plowshares Group is designed to encourage the denuclearization of the world and to be a watchdog for nuclear accidents and nuclear proliferation and the exchange in the black market of nuclear fissile material and so on. And he said something that was so startling, Larry. He said, already, if this situation in Japan gets no worse, it's already the third worst nuclear accident in history. The first was 3 Mile Island. The second was Chernobyl. And he said, already, it's the third worst. It's probably going to go way beyond 3 Mile Island, and it could, and if you were watching the news this morning, they're greatly concerned that this is going to melt down and actually move into the China syndrome, where the nuclear heat becomes so great that it actually begins to bore down through the floor and into the earth, because the heat is just more than even the crust of the earth can withstand. So we won't know the answer to this for many days, maybe weeks, but we're living in one of the nuclear moments of human history, and it's just a coincidence that this conversation was set for today. So go forward a couple here. So here are these dates. If you think of the great nuclear moments, if you want to use the term great in terms of magnitude rather than in a moral sense, but the three actual wartime applications of nuclear weapons, the test in Alamogordo on July 16, 1945, and then the uses of the atomic bomb over Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, and a different type of atomic bomb over Nagasaki on August 9th, putting the close to World War II. And then you have these three accidents. There have been other nuclear accidents, but none that reach this magnitude. And so if you just go forward a couple of these slides, this is where Chernobyl is. It's in the Ukraine, no longer part of the Soviet Union. There's what happened. That's what happened to the principal plant. Over, I think it's 400 people died, but 340,000 people were radiated. And there are certain parts of the area around Chernobyl which have been permanently evacuated, and there is a full generation of humans and animals like cattle and sheep and so on that have been mutated because of the accident at Chernobyl. That wasn't true at 3 Mile Island. It's a surprisingly small amount of radiation escaped in Pennsylvania at that time. But this is a photograph from there. This is the radiation footprint of Chernobyl. You can see how extensive it was. It didn't just, you usually think of downwind as going east, but you can see that some of it went up into Finland and Norway and Sweden. In fact, a great deal of it, and some on the west coast of Great Britain, but all the way down to Italy. I just found this on the internet, but here's an artist's rendition of the fallout footprint of Chernobyl. Here's 3 Mile Island. That's America's most significant nuclear accident in the peaceful uses of nuclear power. As I said before, not much effect. Go to these slides. These were just immediate pictures. What I find so interesting about these photographs, these have nothing to do with the nuclear aspect of Japan, but they are not that different from pictures you see of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. That the devastation of the earthquake is just that dramatic. Go forward.
It's interesting to say that the Prime Minister this morning in Japan said that this is the worst disaster to happen to Japan since World War II.
Exactly. So think of that. I mean, the end of World War II, when we were dropping incendiary bombs, not nuclear weaponry, but incendiary bombs on Tokyo and other cities. Over 1 million Japanese were killed during those bombings, plus Hiroshima, about 120,000, Nagasaki, about 85,000 dead immediately. The utter breakdown of the Japanese economy, I mean, the shattering of Japan. In fact, when they were planning to determine site locations for the atomic weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki and so on, one of the concerns was that there weren't any intact Japanese cities to bomb, that there might not be targets because everything had already been almost reduced to rubble by traditional ordnance. And so when I heard this morning, the Japanese Prime Minister saying this is the worst catastrophe for Japan since 1945, that's a pretty chilling thing.
Pretty chilling.
This is just a picture of the tsunami. Here are the nuclear plants in Japan. Japan has very few natural resources, so it's extremely heavily dependent on nuclear power. And I believe the plants in question are on the northern tip of the island, aren't they, Larry? Yeah. There's the explosion that occurred in the building, and the question now is, what happened in the explosion? Is it just that the heat blew the roof off that building, or was there a release of radioactivity? And there's some evidence that there has been a significant release. That's the plant before the catastrophe. Now on to Larry. This is a picture of you, Larry.
Yeah.
Look at you. What are you, 7? We're trusting our nuclear future to you? Yeah. Look at you.
Actually, this is a good segue to talk a little bit about this. And we're going to get to North Dakota here, but I think we need to understand the Cold War and the nuclear forces in their totality. And so this is really, I was telling Clay earlier today, we've got a lot of slides and a lot of pictures, so this really is going to be a conversation here rather than a lecture. We're going to try to talk through these things, but actually, this is an interesting picture for a couple of reasons.
Lots of reasons.
Yes, not just because of the glasses I'm wearing. But, actually, this is General Welsh, who at the time was becoming SINCSAC. I got to think here. This is probably about
SINCSAC.
I'm sorry, Commander-in-Chief of the Strategic Air Command. Thank you. But this is probably about 1982, I'm going to guess, or something like that, 83 maybe. At any rate, so we're in what's actually a mock-up of what it looks like underground. And it's a simulator, and you go in there, and it's all computerized, and you actually run you run the weapon system, and they have, they input faults into the system, and then you've got to respond to the systems. And there's 2 people in a Minuteman site. One is the commander, and one is the deputy. I'm the deputy sitting at what's called the Deputy Council, and that's my commander standing in the background. And at one point in time, if anybody was ever going to become Chief of Staff of the Air Force, you were going to have to somewhere dip your toe into nuclear weaponry. You're going to have to somehow make a pass through the Strategic Air Command. And this really goes back to Curtis LeMay. Curtis LeMay became commander of the Strategic Air Command in 1948. And from that time on, nuclear power was the important power of the Air Force. Everybody else was important, but the really important people were in the Strategic Air Command and operated nuclear weapons and all that. And we'll talk about that strategy too, but you wanted to say something.
I was just going to say that this was a deliberate political decision by the Air Force. The Air Force was carved out of the Army Air Force. Right. And when the Air Force began, there was some concern about what its roles would be. The Air Force was born at the time of the atomic age, really reaching its early maturity. And the Air Force politically decided that its future was in carrying atomic weaponry in airplanes. And so they wedded themselves to this future, and that's been a lot of the source of the politics since.
Yeah. In fact, let's discuss that for a little bit, and then I'll get back to the picture and General Welsh. But World War II demonstrated the superiority of strategic air power. That's what the airmen concluded, is that World War II showed that with strategic, and we're not talking just nuclear there, but strategic power, the conventional bombings of European cities, Japanese cities, and you take that and you marry that to nuclear weaponry that we saw demonstrated in August of 1945, that if you're going to win a war in the future, you're going to have this tremendous capability to deliver strategic power someplace. And the Air Force believed it was in the best position to do that. So they come out of 1945 with that idea, and in 1946 already, then the Strategic Air Command is created. The Air Force isn't created until 1947. That's how important people view strategic power, is that 1946, before there's even an Air Force, we're going to have a Strategic Air Command. And in 1947, the Air Force is created, and as Clay mentioned, the arguments about roles and missions, there were basically two roles, right? To go fight a war or to defend the United States. And that's really an oversimplification, but the Navy always saw their role as defense of the United States, defense sort of the homeland. They would project power out, which they did during World War II, there's no problem with that, but their real role was defense of the homeland. And of course the Army's role was to go out there and fight in the battle and battle space and all that. And along come these guys that everybody else, the Navy and the Army and the Marine Corps, thought were just in a supporting role. Well, all of a sudden, 1947, they become their own force. They've got a strategic air force. We now have nuclear power. There's only probably about 5 bombs at that time. Very small, but at any rate, now the Air Force is coming of its own, and they have 2 big arguments going on. One of them is with the Navy, and the Navy is saying, our responsibility is to defend the homeland. And the Air Force is saying, defending the homeland is irrelevant unless you control the air and you can deliver strategic power to the enemy, which everybody agreed, even in 45, was going to be the Soviet Union. From the get-go, they went from allies immediately into being the enemy again. So everybody agreed in 1945 it was going to be the Soviets, and you were going to have to project that power. So the first argument they have is with the Navy. Then the second argument they have is with the Army, and that gets into ICBMs, because the Army saw ICBM, intercontinental ballistic missiles, and IRBMs, intermediate range ballistic missiles. They saw those as just another piece of artillery. If you're in the Army and you fire artillery, then these missiles are nothing different. And so the Army should be in control of them. Well, in both of those arguments, from 45 through 48, the Air Force won. The Air Force stood up, as I said, the Strategic Air Command. The Air Force got responsibility for strategic deterrence of the enemy. That was the Soviet Union. And the Air Force ended up with the missile program, as opposed to the Navy getting it, although they did have some small missiles and artillery pieces. But anyway,
just before
I took
you
off.
go
So
on,
now I'll go back to
no, but one last thing about that. The forward mission of the Air Force, after World War II, the Soviet Union not only continued to occupy East Germany and Eastern Europe, but it actually annexed portions of Eastern Europe, and it was prepared to fight against the West, particularly the United States and Britain, and amassed over 1 million tanks on the Eastern Bloc. And the United States was now in a peace dividend mood. The war was over. There were lots of attempts to cut funding for our armed services and to bring the boys home and to normalize them through the GI Bill of Rights and so on. And so the United States didn't want to have an army permanently stationed in Europe large enough to prevent a Soviet attack to the West. And so our option was to use the Air Force to be able to carry ordnance, both conventional bombs and nuclear bombs, across the ocean or from bases in Europe to counter the tank superiority and the personnel superiority of the Soviet Union. So the Air Force intelligently said, we can do that. Instead of stationing 1 million men in Europe, we can just have bases, and we'll be able to use our strategic bombing capacities to counter the tank superiority of the Soviet Union.
And nuclear weapons always figured into that strategy.
Because a nuclear weapon is a very inexpensive form of war compared to, say, having 500,000 troops in France or Germany.
And with just a couple bombs, you can stop 500,000 troops from coming across.
So the Air Force was very smart about the way it positioned itself in all of this.
Okay. Well, I'm kind of laughing because I'm sure there's probably some Army and Navy guys out here that say, this is all bull, guys. We know the truth here. We'll talk some more about that strategy here in a little bit. But anyway, back to this picture, and then we've got some more pictures here. So General Welsh came to the base, and we were really indoctrinating him, if you will, into nuclear weapons, particularly ICBMs. It was the first time he'd actually visited an ICBM base. We took him in the trainer. We showed him how we did it. We went through an entire war sequence and delivering weapons on target. We showed him how to do that. We showed him how we would, the whole thing. So we did all that.
Where is this now?
This is at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri.
In Missouri.
Yeah. But interestingly, when he showed up, everybody knew, and everybody told us when we were doing it, this guy's going to become Chief of Staff of the Air Force. And that's the reason why he's going through SAC. So it was absolutely vital that someone that's going to command the Air Force have this background someplace in nuclear weaponry and someplace through the Strategic Air Command. So it really used to hold a lot of sway in the Air Force.
So if you had screwed this moment up, then what?
Oh, I don't know. He wouldn't have known the difference.
Oh, okay, good.
Yeah.
I was just thinking you might have prevented the Air Force from being born.
Okay. What else did you
There's
put
another
in?
picture.
Oh, there
of
you put it. Okay.
Wait, now hold on this next one. But there you are.
Actually, this is graduation from ICBM.
Really?
Yeah, this is in Vandenberg Air Force Base in California.
That's your graduation in California?
Yeah.
And how old would you have been there?
Oh, I don't know. I have no idea.
Well, I don't know.
30-something.
I don't know how the audience feels about the set of pictures, but when I was preparing this PowerPoint, an amazing kind of insight came to me. Can you show the next slide?
Oh, yeah, right. Okay. I hate to do this because you know Clay, guys.
Don't you think? It's...
All right.
Okay.
Okay. So now we're going to get serious here, and we're going to talk more about the Cold War and the origins of it, and we're going to go right back to the start of it. And you ready?
Yeah. You want
Okay.
me to say something?
Yes.
Well, let's start with Europe, just quickly. So, World War II ends, and the United States and the Soviet Union are allies. But they become increasingly unhappy allies as the war draws to an end. And Stalin thought that Britain and the United States were stalling on the invasion of Europe so that the Soviets would bear the brunt of the war. And so he actually felt that his allies, Britain and the United States, were not cooperating fully because they wanted him to bear the brunt of the war both in human costs and in financial costs, so that he would effectively punch himself out, and then we would come in at the last second and claim credit and glory. And so Stalin was becoming very unhappy with the West for what he regarded as our political posturing and stalling. The West was offended by the Soviet Union because it had already become clear by the late 1944, early period of 1945, that Stalin was not intending to release Poland. That, if you think about the history of Russia, one invasion after the next has come to Russia from Napoleon to Hitler, and the path is always through Poland, because Poland is a wide plain, it's a natural corridor into Russia. And so the Soviet Union Stalin decided that once the war was won, he was never going to let this happen again. So he was going to create a perimeter set of nations, the key of which would be Poland, and not release them into their own self-governments or into the supervision of the West, because he was going to protect his underbelly by occupying Eastern Europe. And this offended everybody because, after all, remember, the war began when Germany invaded Poland. That's what brought France and Britain and eventually the United States into the war. So now the war ends, and Poland, about which the war had been fought in some sense, now was going to be a satellite of the Soviet Union, and part of it was actually carved off into the Soviet Union, and the rest permanently occupied. And so this became clear between Yalta, which was in 1944 and 1945, and then Potsdam, which came after the death of FDR. And during that, between those two conferences, first FDR and Churchill and then Truman became profoundly disenchanted with what they regarded as Soviet plans in the post-war period. And so both sides, we had been allies with the Soviet Union for one purpose, to defeat Nazi Germany. And the minute it became clear that that defeat was going to happen, both of those belligerents began to be suspicious of each other. And that's, wouldn't you say, the origins of all this?
Well, what do you think about the idea of Joe Stalin's idea that the West was just hesitating? I mean, when I taught at the Air Force Academy, we used to have a military historian, and he said whenever he taught the build-up to D-Day, he says, before D-Day, he says, we had Nazis killing commies and commies killing Nazis. What a beautiful day. And his whole attitude was that let them do it. Let them continue to fight and grind out, and the more that they kill each other, the fewer of them we've got to worry about when we finally land.
Well, I don't know the first thing about this, Larry, so I mean, I wouldn't be able to say. These are speculations, like the speculation that FDR knew that the Japanese were going to attack Pearl Harbor. Everything I've read a lot about this, but I'm by no means an expert. And what I've read is that Churchill and Eisenhower were waiting to invade Europe until we knew we could do it successfully, and they would have liked to have done it sooner, but it was decided that we needed to secure North Africa first, and so that our strategic planning was not done with an eye to letting the two belligerents punch themselves out. What do you think?
Okay.
Do you have an opinion about this?
No.
Why'd you ask?
I just want to know what you thought.
So anyway,
let's get to Oppie then.
So
we've
one
laid
way we
groundwork.
choose to win the war is to develop atomic weapons. And we developed atomic weapons really to stop Hitler, because it was widely held that Hitler was moving towards an atomic device. And the Manhattan Project was an emergency British-American project to get a bomb before Hitler did. And that's what led to the unprecedented appropriation of more than $2 billion during the war, when that money was desperately needed somewhere else. And the brain drain from radar and other ordnance questions into a secret facility at Los Alamos. And so this thing was done almost entirely in secrecy. At the end of the war, Truman, after the death of Franklin Roosevelt on April 12, 1945, Truman did not know of the existence of the Manhattan Project until the day afterwards. And so this has been one of the best kept secrets in the history of warfare.
With thousands of people working on it.
Thousands of people. The Soviets, by the way, knew what was going on at Los Alamos, but our own government, our own Senate didn't know. So this project was done with this enormous urgency for one purpose only, which was to knock out Hitler before he could use an atomic weapon on Stalingrad or Moscow, or for that matter, London. When the D-Day invasion occurred, there was something called the Alsos mission, where we sent in investigative teams to determine how far along the German bomb was. And what we discovered was that there was no German bomb. That in late 1942 or early 1943, Hitler had called in all of his weapons people and said, which weapons can we bring online in time to affect the outcome of the war? And when he determined that he probably couldn't get an atomic device in time to win the war, he said, I'm canceling the project. So the minute that news came to the United States after the suicide of Hitler, there was an enormous anxiety in our atomic community about whether we should now shut it down or go forward with it and use it against Japan. But my point is, it had never been intended for use against Japan. It was used against Japan. That's led to an enormous controversy that's ongoing about whether it was necessary or not. But here's the point with respect to the Cold War. Stalin was told about the atomic device at Potsdam in the last week of July 1945. Potsdam is near Berlin. Truman was there, and Truman had pressed General Leslie Groves, the actual Army leader of the Manhattan Project, to get the test done in time for the Potsdam Conference, because Truman wanted to have that bargaining chip in his pocket when he met with Stalin. And so Groves pushed Oppenheimer and the team at Los Alamos to do it, and on the 16th of July 1945 they did successfully test the world's first atomic device, an implosion plutonium device at Alamogordo, New Mexico. I have some slides of that we can come to in a minute, but once that was tested, the telegram went immediately through diplomatic code to Germany, to Potsdam, and Truman then, on the second last day of the Potsdam Conference, was sitting with Joseph Stalin, and he said at the end, sort of just like as an aside, he said, you know, we've just tested an unprecedented new weapon. And Truman thought that this would stun Stalin. And Stalin said, well, I hope you make the best of it. And Truman was mystified that Stalin didn't respond more appropriately or with greater drama. Stalin already knew that the bomb had been tested. There are spies at Los Alamos who had brought out suitcases of information. And Stalin braved it out with Truman, but then he went back and after the meeting browbeat his own senior advisors and said, we're getting one immediately. But one theory of the cause of the Cold War, this would be Oppenheimer's theory, is that we should have kept Stalin in the loop. They were our allies. We should have been more forthcoming. We shouldn't have created this aura of secrecy and trumping the Soviet Union. And so many scholars see Alamogordo, the Trinity test on the 16th of July, Hiroshima on the 6th of August, and Nagasaki on the 9th of August, not as the last acts of World War II, but in fact as the first three acts of the Cold War. And Stalin and many Soviet diplomats said as much, that this was done to impress us, not to wind up the war. The war had already been won. And so there's this kind of strange interlocking period, isn't there, where World War II is winding down, but the United States is already trying to send unmistakable signals that we are not going to let Soviet communism absorb Europe or have its way after the war. But Oppenheimer and many others believed that if we had been more forthcoming, the tensions and the mutual recriminations and the breakdown of the relationship between the two great nations would not have occurred.
Yeah. A couple of thoughts come to mind as you're talking about that. First, let's go back to the secrecy issue. One of the things that absolutely dominates the Cold War is that sense of secrecy on everything. And the United States government has used this very effectively, by the way, in stamping stuff top secret that even remotely is connected somehow to a strategic weapon system or to the delivery of a strategic weapon system or any of that. And that goes right back to the Manhattan Project, where all of this was done in absolute secrecy.
And that's the thesis of Gary Will's book, right? Say what that thesis is.
Well, well, I don't know if relative to the secrecy?
That this created...
It creates a national secrecy in the federal government. And it creates what he calls bomb power. And that gets into a whole other issue, I think, here, but about the power of the President of the United States, and I don't think that's where
But the larger point that he's making, I think, is that the secrecy surrounding that project became a habit for the United States government throughout the Cold War and was used, in his opinion, inappropriately on non-nuclear questions, because this became, the fact that this had to be done in such secrecy with no congressional oversight of any sort produced bad habits in American government, I think is what he's trying to say.
And the other thing that I was thinking about as you were talking about that is this demonstration of the Soviet Union. Many folks would say that, and you've already alluded to this, but we didn't have to drop 2 atomic bombs on the Japanese to defeat the Japanese.
They were defeated.
They were defeated. But by dropping those 2 bombs on the Japanese, we certainly sent a message to the Soviet Union, which is really an immoral way of looking at that. Harry Truman, to his dying days, said, I dropped the bomb on those cities for one reason, and that was to end the war. Because there were arguments about how many Americans would actually die if they landed on the islands. you know, and I'll accept Harry Truman's statement on that.
Well, his statement was, if I saved one American GI, I needed to use it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. In fact, what if the Americans had found out that he had this secret weapon and had not used it, and had instead decided to invade the island at the great loss of life, and he'd have been impeached, and we'd think of him very. Anyway, okay. Did you want to talk about Oppie?
Well, the only point to make about Oppenheimer before we move on is that Oppenheimer was the father of the atomic bomb, and he did an absolutely magnificent job in creating it on time, under budget. It worked. The first 3 times they used it, it worked. They were all very concerned that it would fizzle. Once the bomb had been dropped, if you go to the next slide of Oppenheimer, he said at the time of the detonation, "I am become death, the shatterer of worlds." He was quoting from the Hindu sacred text, the Bhagavad Gita. And he spent the rest of his life, he lived till 1967, fretting about the implications of the atomic age. And he argued that the atomic bomb was different from conventional ordnance, not just in degree but in kind, that it represented a new chapter in the history of human destructiveness, and that if we ever tried to normalize it and use it just as a much bigger bomb, that there would inevitably be World War III, and World War III would end with the relative annihilation of most people on Earth. And so he then became one of the champions of containment, not of the Soviet Union, but restraint of the use of the bomb. And because of that, he opposed the hydrogen bomb. He opposed the hydrogen bomb because he believed that it was a genocidal weapon, and that's what got him destroyed during the Cold War. So the father of the bomb, one of our supreme leaders in weaponry and strategy, was removed from the arena during the Cold War. That's how seriously the country was moving towards a heavy, heavy nuclear future. And the reason I brought it up with you is because Curtis LeMay and the Strategic Air Command had wedded themselves to a nuclear future. That's what you had said earlier. And Oppenheimer was opposing that future, and because of that, the Air Force took the lead in getting him destroyed. Mm-hmm. And so he becomes a martyr to the nuclear age.
And Oppenheimer really wanted to turn over control of nuclear weapons to an international
body, and he was a proponent of the Atomic Energy Commission, which was the civilianization of our nuclear information. And he believed that the UN should share these secrets, and that we should freely share our nuclear secrets with the Soviet Union and anyone who wanted them.
And renouncing first use.
Right, so he became a persona non grata in military Cold War circles because he was regarded as insufficiently warlike.
Okay,
this is Ground Zero. Just for those who are interested in this sort of thing, you can go there twice a year. This is at White Sands Missile Base in New Mexico. I've been once. It's an extraordinary experience. This is before the detonation. That's the tower on which the first atomic device was placed for detonation. Here's the marker at Ground Zero. They open it on the first day of April and the first day of October, the first Saturday of October and the first Saturday of April every year. This is the thing. And then one more here. This is trinitite. This is the sand of the desert out there that was fused into a green glass by the bomb. And there are signs up all over the site, Larry, saying, in huge letters, saying, under no circumstances must you ever search for trinitite. Searching for trinitite is a felony. It's dangerous, and you will be arrested. And they're all over the site. So my friend and I went at dawn to go there, and so we're going in the dark, and we get in there, and we spend about 7 or 8 hours there, and we're coming back to go back out to Santa Fe, and outside the perimeter of the gate, it's about 15 miles into the site, outside the perimeter of the gate, there are booths set up in every direction with people saying, trinitite here, get your trinitite, and it's like a cottage industry. But we didn't see that going in because it was pitch dark. So I bought some trinitite. There's the Enola Gay, that's Paul Tibbets, who dropped the first atomic device on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. There's the detonation. There's the footprint. That's one of the biggest concerns was how much physical devastation will there be and how much radioactive devastation will there be. And this, if we had more time, we could spend time thinking about this, but this is the Hiroshima footprint, and it became the basis of all future nuclear strategy.
And maybe everybody knows this, but when you're dealing with nuclear weapons, you don't drop a bomb on the ground that blows up. It's blowing up in the air. So this was probably an explosion that was 1,500 feet
In the air.
in the air, and then the blast goes down and causes the destruction.
125,000 deaths within one day. This is a famous image of Hiroshima, and this one I apologize for. That's what it looks like. Then Edward Teller, the father of the hydrogen bomb, we'll just skip that. There he is. That he's regarded as Dr. Strangelove, the sort of the dark star of the nuclear age, but he more than anyone was the advocate of our development of hydrogen fusion weaponry as opposed to just atomic fission. This is the map of Eastern Europe after the war. You see the dark red is the Soviet Union. The lighter red is places they literally annexed after the war. The pink is areas that they controlled in the Eastern Bloc after the war. So this gives you a sense of why the West, Larry, was so paranoid. I mean, the war is over and the Soviet Union has expanded. That's the result of the war, is that the Soviet Union has expanded deep into traditional Europe. And so it makes perfect sense that the West would be paranoid about this. And can you just now quickly talk about the long telegraph?
That's what I was just going to say. Well, I don't think we've got a picture of George Kennan in here, but George Kennan plays a really important part in this. He's a United States State Department foreign officer. He is in Moscow. He understands the Soviets better than any other American. And in 1946, he just doesn't believe that the Americans understand the Soviet Union. And so he writes what's called the long telegram, the longest telegram ever sent to the State Department. And he sends this to his superiors of the State Department, very long telegram. And in effect, what he says is the Soviet Union will continue to push at its borders as long as we let it.
Right. I'm showing the other map now, but he's saying, have you looked at this map? I mean, they have expanded, they have annexed, they're hegemonic in Eastern Europe. This is not an ally. We have to be urgently responding to this move of empire.
Right. And the word that he uses in this thing that becomes then official U.S. policy is he says that we have got to contain the Soviet Union. And later on, then that becomes the whole policy of containment. And the whole idea of containment is it's sort of like taking a balloon and squeezing on it, and it pops out through your fingers or something. Every time it pops out, then you've got to exert pressure back to hold it back in. And so every place where it looked like the Soviet Union might pop out, in Turkey, in Greece, and we end up with the Truman Doctrine out of that in 1947, where Truman says we will do anything that we have to do to contain the communists to the Soviet Union.
Anywhere on earth.
Anywhere.
Yeah, so, I mean, the Truman Doctrine says we will, if the Soviet Union appears to be expanding into Southeast Asia, and Vietnam or Korea, we will stop them there. If it's in Cuba or South America, we will stop them there. He decides that the United States will do whatever it takes to prevent any further expansion of the Soviet empire.
And Kennan spends the rest of his life arguing against military intervention. Kennan says, no, that's not what I meant. You can do this politically, you can do this with economics. There's so many ways to do this, but you're not supposed to be putting boots on the ground in South Vietnam, for example, as part of the policy of containment. But that's why we were there. That's why we responded in 1950 to the invasion of South Korea by North Korea. And it's all part of the policy of containment. So the only way to understand what happened relative to U.S.-Soviet Union interaction is understanding that George Kennan in 1946 said, we've got to contain the Soviet Union. So everything else the United States does after that is to contain the Soviet Union.
You know, Larry, can I just be the advocate of the audience here?
Please.
I'm sure that they're thinking, are you two knuckleheads going to ever talk about North Dakota? So shouldn't we do that?
Yeah. All right. What is this, Clay?
That's your slide of the...
Okay. Just the total warheads. I don't know why it's placed
when
in
each
this
country
part,
came,
but-
when each country came into the nuclear age. USA 1945, Russia 49, and so on.
Okay, ICBM. Let's talk a little bit about ICBMs. Like I said, we got these pictures kind of disjointed. We'll have this discussion here. But this will now, we're getting right to North Dakota. Is this place to talk about Grand Forks? Or no, you've got a map, don't you?
Yep.
Okay, well, let me just tell you what this picture is. This is kind of an interesting picture. We've got, I guess it'd be on your left. You've got the white ones, the 4 white missiles that you see are the American missiles. All the other missiles are Soviet missiles, and I think there might be some Chinese missiles. I don't know if there's any Chinese ones on there. But the point is of this, that those that advocated most strongly for the expansion of nuclear programs in the United States and the delivery of weapons towards the Soviet Union used the pictures like this and depictions like this to show that we're very small compared to what the Soviet Union has. The Soviet Union's throw weight is tremendous. On their SS-18s or SS-20s, they would throw things that were measured in megatons. Megatons. Millions of tons of TNT. Okay. We had, the largest bomb that we had was on a Titan, and so that's the one that's on your far left, and that threw 9 megaton bombs. Threw one, and we had 54 Titans. They were in Arizona, Kansas, and Arkansas. And they would throw each one of them, so you got 54 missiles, you got 54 warheads, 54 bombs, and each one was 9 megatons. So that's 9 million tons of TNT. The Soviets, their missiles were throwing 20 megaton, 21 megaton, 25 megaton. So when the United States negotiators sat down to talk with the Soviet Unions, and people were saying, well, let's limit the number of warheads, the United States kept saying, we need to tie what we're throwing equally there. So if you got a 25 megaton bomb and somebody else has a 9 megaton bomb, well, they shouldn't be looked at equally. Although they were.
Almost 3 times different in destructive power. But let's just back up for a moment. So here's what happens, Larry, that World War II ends. The doctrine of containment is born in the United States. The Soviets have occupied Eastern Europe. Curtis LeMay creates the Strategic Air Command, and we're going to be able to deliver weaponry to Europe in the event of a war. Just about this time, this missile technology comes into play, and the first great notice that we get of it as a people is Sputnik in 1957. So in 1957, this is the space program, but they're heavily interrelated. In 1957, the Soviets put Sputnik into orbit, and we realized that they have an ICBM missile that can deliver Sputnik into space. Theoretically, then it can also drop a warhead on the United States. And so the United States goes into a gigantic panic. And between 1957 and 1960, this is virtually all we talk about. And the peaceful application of this is the space program, Mercury, Gemini, Apollo landing on the moon. But there's a military application of all of this. And in 1960, John Kennedy campaigns for the presidency saying there's a missile gap and that we are in great danger because of Soviet superiority. We have to catch up and get ahead of him. And so just at this time, this is where North Dakota begins to come into the picture, because we began developing in a crash program ICBM missiles, and those missiles have to be placed somewhere, and a large number of them wind up being placed here. So go ahead.
I was just going to give some numbers here. You just mentioned the missile gap. So let's take the presidential election of 1960. When John Kennedy ran on the platform that there was a missile gap, that the Soviets were way ahead of us in this whole nuclear arms race, and we had to do something about it. At that time, in 1960, the Soviets had 1,605 nuclear weapons.
Total.
The United States had 20,434. Almost 20 times what the Soviets held. And yet there was a missile, and yet Jack Kennedy ran on the missile gap.
And he
And there
knew
wasn't.
he was lying when he said it. I mean, he got trapped. He knew he was lying. It was very useful in the campaign. And this book on the Cold War, which is a tremendous book, Martin Walker's History of the Cold War, has a long chapter on how Kennedy imprisoned himself because he won the election and now he had to deliver on these missiles. And so we went way beyond what we needed to do to catch up. We didn't need to catch up. And so the American policy was trapped for a decade by this campaign promise that Kennedy had made, which was based on no real truth. So let's move on.
The first time the Soviet Union had more nuclear weapons than the United States was 1978. By that time, here's a humbling thought, by that time the United States had 24,826 nuclear weapons and the Soviets had 25,393. Now think of these. In the world, there were 51,000 nuclear weapons by this time. All of them much, much larger than the two that were exploded in 1945.
Hundreds of times larger.
Hundreds of times.
All right, so let's go on. These are the missiles. This is a map which is kind of interesting to look at. This is where the missiles were placed. You see the two wings in North Dakota, one at Minot and one at Grand Forks, in Montana at Maelstrom, Ellsworth in South Dakota, Warren in Wyoming, then in Missouri. Was that White, did you say?
Whiteman.
Whiteman. Yeah. And so this is the zone.
But this is only the Minuteman missiles. We start off, we have the Atlas, and the Atlases predominantly were in Wyoming, and then they're phased out very quickly. The Minuteman missiles replace them, and then we have Minuteman missiles, then what we're showing here are the 5 bases, Malmstrom in Montana, Grand Forks, Minot, F.E. Warren in Wyoming, and Whiteman in Missouri, and then, as I've already mentioned, there were 3 Titan bases as well.
So this is just the Minutemen set, but heavily related to the Great Plains. There's the Soviet Union's. We'll just skip over that. Their missile complex. Let's go on to North Dakota.
North Dakota, we got there.
Yeah, 1 hour in, yeah. So I just find this map absolutely stunning, Larry. This is a map that was produced based on 1980 international strategy. If there had been a nuclear exchange with the Soviet Union in 1980, this is after the invasion of Afghanistan, the Cold War is at a particularly tense moment. This is what it would have looked like. The brown, the purple brown is where people would die of fallout. There would be, you can explain it better than I, but we had 300 silos in North Dakota at that point, right? Mm-hmm. And some of them had 1 warhead and some of them had 3 warheads. So we had something like 450 or 500 missiles in North Dakota, or warheads in North Dakota, on top of 300 missiles. If there had been an exchange with the Soviet Union, they would have targeted at least 1 missile at every one of our missiles, and sometimes 2 and 3 for overkill. So if that had happened, there would have been hundreds of missiles flying into North Dakota airspace and detonating not only the Grand Forks Air Force Base and the Minot Air Force Base, but radar facilities around the state, probably Garrison Dam, the major cities of North Dakota, and then they would have targeted each of those missile silos, right? So if this had happened, it would have killed virtually everybody, but the purple is where the radioactive fallout would be certain to kill. The lighter brown is where it's likely to kill, and it works its way down. Just wanted you to know that Marmarth, oh, that slide is off, but Marmarth would have survived, which is reason to move to Marmarth. My county, Stark County, would have been just fine, Bowman County. Here's the state of North Dakota that we turned into a Cold War zone, traditionally an agrarian farm state. This is what's so interesting to me, Larry. I've been reading Mr. Wheat by Andrea and Rick Collin about Milton R. Young. Just read this. Isn't this interesting? That North Dakota made the case at the end of the war in the 50s that we needed military facilities here because we were one of the few states that didn't have them. And Senator Young became a champion of that notion that there was a fairness doctrine and we needed bases here. Then, this is too long to read, this breaks the Jane rule, but Bismarck and Minot were going to be the sites of the SAC bases. First they were Defense Command bases and then SAC bases, but they were going to locate them in Bismarck and Fargo. But the cities of Minot and Grand Forks actually went into a kind of public relations Chamber of Commerce campaign to get these bases sited there. And we've been reading some about that. Remember that Grand Forks, a group of businessmen in Grand Forks actually formed a committee and went out and bought
And Minot.
and Minot bought the land where these bases would be located and then donated it to the U.S. Air Force. They bid for these facilities for good reason. They've been a tremendous economic boon to those cities, but Bismarck and Minot were upset, and Evan Lips, famous Bismarck legislator, spent a long time after this being bitter that these bases were taken away from Bismarck and Fargo and placed instead at Grand Forks and Minot. So let's finally get to the point and look at the Cold War footprint in North Dakota. There's a map of North Dakota. So there was, and this was also the work of Senator Young, a radar facility at Fortuna. There it is. It was in place from 1952 to 1979. There were 2 SAC bases, first ADC and then SAC bases, one at Minot.
Why don't we talk just a little bit about this?
Go for
Okay.
it.
When the bases were first opened up in both Minot and Grand Forks, they were actually Air Defense Command bases. The whole idea is that we've got to stop the Soviet Union from coming over the pole,
bombers.
basically, with bombers and attacking the United States. That was the whole theory behind it. So what they really did at both Grand Forks and Minot, they put down radar stations on the base that could look over the plains and look north. And then they had fighters stationed there so that if bombers come flying towards North Dakota or the United States, these fighters would take off and they would end up going and shooting those bombers down, hopefully over Canada, I suspect, that they would end up shooting those down. And it was all part of, and actually it ended up with the NORAD agreement between Canada and the United States was supportive of these defensive measures. And so it started off there, but very quickly the Strategic Air Command then came in and they started putting bombers, first refuelers. A bomber, when it takes off and it's going to fly all the way to Soviet Union, it takes a lot of fuel. So when it takes off, the first thing it has to do is get into a track, and then a refueling airplane takes off, or is already up there, and then they connect, and then they fill that bomber full of fuel so they can make the long flight all the way to the Soviet Union. So the first thing that Grand Forks and Minot had that was assigned to the Strategic Air Command was refueling wings, so that when the bombers would take off from Michigan or Montana or wherever they are, they would meet in track, and I'm just speculating here, probably over Canada someplace. They'd meet up with the refuelers that came from this very close location. They could refuel them, and then they could take off towards the Soviet Union, understanding that nuclear war is always theoretical war. And so that's the theory behind that. But then very quickly, the United States Air Force said, well, we can just put bombers there too. So they had bombers and refuelers, and then after that, then it was decided, well, we just as well put missiles there too. So we ended up then, Grand Forks Air Force Base would have had, once they probably kept fighters for a little while, but generally speaking, they had refueling, they had bombers, B-52s, mostly bombers, and then ICBMs in the ground around Grand Forks, and they would have done the very same thing in Minot. So that's how they made the transition.
So they started as defensive facilities, fighter jets to shoot down Soviet bombers.
Right.
They morphed into a forward delivery system for nuclear weapons or other bombs. And then when the missile age came, they accommodated ICBMs and became support structures for those too. Absolutely. And sometimes they had several of those missions going on at once. This is a schematic diagram of a missile. Do you want to talk about that at all?
Minuteman. Well, the thing talk about, this is a schematic of a Minuteman missile. The thing talk about Minuteman, and the reason Minuteman became so important in the inventory for the Air Force is it had solid fuel. The Atlases and the Titans had used liquid fuel. And the problem with liquid fuel is, number one, it's incredibly unstable. And number two is, you've got to keep them fueled up, and they take a lot of pampering.
Several hours to get ready.
Just to get ready. So the Atlases that were, they actually laid them down in a coffin, they called it, and then they would stand them up when they got ready to fire them and all that, but they had liquid fuel in them. And then the Titans, as already mentioned, they had 54 of those Titans around. But let me tell you how dangerous Titans were. In 1980, there was a maintenance guy in Little Rock, Arkansas, who was working on a Titan missile. And oh, by the way, I said they take a lot of pampering. One of the things you do with Minuteman missiles is you spread them out. So you've got one launch control center, and that launch control center is controlling 10 missiles. None of them closer than 3 miles to the launch control center or to each other. So they're spread over out a very broad area. In fact, I think 85,000 square miles or something like that, 8,500 square miles around Minot, for example, holds this missile field. Well, when you have a Titan, you've got one missile and an entire crew that's there at the missile launch site with that Titan because it's got liquid fuel and it takes a lot of maintenance. Minuteman missiles, you put them on alert, they're sitting out there and go for a very long time without maintenance because it's a solid fuel. So it's not a liquid fuel's in there. Somebody doesn't have to go out there and pat it every once in a while to make sure it's okay. So you could have missiles sitting out there in those silos for a very long time without any interaction with maintenance people. Incredibly reliable system. So anyway, that's the Minuteman.
No, you were talking about what happened at Little Rock.
Did I stop? Oh, sorry. So at Little Rock, got so excited. So at Little Rock, what happened is a maintenance guy was out there working on a Titan missile, and he dropped a socket wrench. And when he did, it punctured the side, punctured it. They're just paper thin. The only thing that holds a Titan missile up is the liquid that's in it. And so it's just like a real thin aluminum can. When it hit, it actually punctured it, it started a leak, it hit electricity, and it blew up. And it threw the 9 megaton bomb out of the hole, killed a number of people that were working in there. Absolute disaster. Nothing like that ever happens in Minuteman because they're not that volatile. And so going to a solid fuel like the Minuteman had made them far more stable of a weapon system and far less dangerous than the Titan. And just shortly after that, all the Titans were taken off of alert.
And all the missiles that have been in North Dakota have been solid fuel,
all of them,
Minuteman missiles. Okay, so that's.
Oh, this is the re-entry vehicle. We'll put this picture in there just to sort of explain how this works. Minuteman 1 had 1 bomb on the top of it. Minuteman 3 could have up to 3 bombs. And I just thought this would be, I told Clay I thought this would be an interesting picture for people to see how this happens. So this is really, for lack of a better term, the nose cone of a Minuteman 3 missile, and each one of those is a bomb. So when you had 3, you've got 3 bombs. Each one is about 300 kilotons. So you got about 900, almost 1,000 kilotons of power in that, the one that shows 3 of them. Or you could download it to 2, and then through START, all of them were downloaded to 1. So they were designed eventually to hold 3 bombs, and they ended up to holding 1. And now all the Minuteman missiles in the United States hold 1 bomb.
But at one time there were 300 silos in North Dakota, missile chambers. Each one had a missile in it, but the Minot group had up to 3, and so the Minot 150 could have 450 nuclear warheads in them, whereas the Grand Forks stayed at 1, isn't that correct?
That's true. The MX, which we never had, Wyoming had, the MX held 10 of these bombs.
In 1 cone?
In 1 cone, 10 of them.
All right. This is, of course...
B-52. Actually, you know, this is a good time to talk about the triad, I think. Nuclear strategy was based on, number 1 is survivability. So you've got nuclear weapons. The most important thing you have to know is that they're going to survive. So if the Soviets were to launch an attack against the United States, the most important thing we have to do is be able to retaliate. Now this is where it goes into insanity, because strategic policy is based on never having to use your weapons. And Curtis LeMay, we can credit him, General Curtis LeMay, he became commander of the Strategic Air Command in 1948. He said, we will have so much power that can be delivered so decisively that we will never have to use it. And that was the whole strategy behind our whole nuclear system that we had all through the Cold War. The idea was that you would be able to survive if somebody tried a sneak attack against you, for example, like Pearl Harbor, when you think about that. If somebody just decided, the Soviets decided we were going to just lob a whole bunch of missiles over to the United States and catch them off guard, not possible, but if they thought they could catch the United States off guard and would hit us, the theory was that we would be able to survive that to retaliate. Okay. Now, number one is you want to know it's coming in before that ever happens. But at any rate, again, remember nuclear war is theoretical war. Well, at any rate, what we ended up with in the United States was called the triad, the nuclear triad. And the nuclear triad would be absolutely survivable so that the Soviet Union would know that any attack on the United States was destined to fail because the United States would be able to retaliate regardless of how they tried to do it. So there were three components to the triad. ICBMs that were land-based and can respond in minutes to a command to launch. And that's why Minuteman was so good, because it can respond immediately. So the National Command Authorities tell the Minuteman crew force to launch, they can launch, and it's in minutes. Okay. Then you've got the B-52s, the bombers. They're in the air. And up until a few years ago, probably 10 years ago,
yeah,
or so, there were B-52s flying all the time. While we were comfortably sleeping in our homes, there were B-52s up on tracks flying around. They were going to be survivable. And those were loaded with nuclear weapons too. So if the Soviet Union figured out a way to get to our ICBMs and to neutralize the ICBM force, the bomber force was already in the air. So the bomber force was already on its way to the Soviet Union to retaliate.
This was the fail-safe system. Grand Forks and Minot were both involved in it. So you'd send B-52s over the North Pole. They'd be on their way to Soviet airspace. They would have targets, and at some point we would call them back. And they reach a fail-safe point where they either have to commit or come back. And so there's a famous film called Fail-Safe about when that broke down. But the idea was if you have planes in the air, something survives. You're going to be able to deliver nuclear weapons to Moscow and St. Petersburg and so on,
right,
even if they hit your ground bases in the United States. So the third element.
But your ICBMs cannot be called back.
Right.
And I do remember during when Ronald Reagan was debating, whatever year that would have been, 80? Anybody help me? Is that when Reagan?
That's when he was running for president.
And somebody, there was a question about nuclear weapons, and what if they were launched, and then we didn't want to launch them, and he said we just recall them, and all of us in the ICBM force are going, huh? There's no way to do that.
Once they're up, they go.
Once you turn your key and that missile comes out of the hole, it's gone. It's going to deliver on target in 30 minutes.
So number one in your triad is missiles. Number two is planes.
The planes. And then the third, submarines. The SLBM, submarine launched ballistic missiles. And we got a little picture of one. There's an SLBM coming out of the ocean. Now, the SLBMs, the problem with submarines is it takes them a long time. They've got to come up so high, they can only be so far underwater when they launch. It takes them a long time to stabilize, it does all of that, but they're incredibly hard to find. And so the third piece of the triad is the fact that the Soviets can say, okay, this is how we're going to knock out the bombers, this is how we're going to knock out the ICBMs, but they still have to deal with the submarines. So submarines are out there cruising along the ocean, and we've had submarines for many, many years, still are, but they were out there. The Soviets didn't know where they're at. They could pop up if the National Command Authorities decided that we were under attack and we had to launch, then they would send that out. The bombers would take off, the ICBMs would launch, and then the SLBMs would launch, but they would be the last ones to launch. But they're incredibly, they're not vulnerable.
They're mobile.
They're mobile and they're hard to... Just think about when the first Iraq War, when we tried to find the Scud missiles, how difficult that was. Because the Scuds were on trucks and they're driving around and they're hiding, and you get a shot from a satellite and you say, oh, well, they're behind this hill. Well, by the time that's been interpreted and they're behind that hill, those guys had lunch and they're gone. They're 20 miles away. And that's why the Scuds were incredibly hard. So the submarines did for us the same thing.
So the idea of this is no matter what they do to us,
no matter what they do to us,
something survives,
we're survivable.
and that we can project so much nuclear force against them that they will be rational and never strike because they know they can't get every missile, every plane, every warhead, and every submarine. That's the whole theory of deterrence.
And the key to nuclear deterrence is that the same is true about them.
And so,
The key to nuclear deterrence is that we believe that they are as invulnerable as we are. That's what keeps stability in the nuclear age.
So as we talk about the Cold War footprint in North Dakota, our theme, we have talked about radar facility at Fortuna. We've talked about our 2 bases, which have morphed from one thing to another, the 300 missiles that have been in the ground. At this moment,
bombers.
the Grand Forks wing has been decommissioned. So
Correct.
only the Minot wing of 150 silos continues, and each one of them has one and only one warhead.
Right.
At this point.
Right.
And there have been attempts recently to remove all of them, but there still are 150 nuclear warheads underground in the Minot wing in North Dakota, right?
Right.
Okay, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, North Dakota has 2 legs of that triad that I just described.
Bombers
Bombers
and missiles.
missiles.
So then we had the ABM site. The ABM site was developed to, remember when we showed that map of the deaths that would result from a nuclear attack, the idea here was that we would create an array of anti-ballistic missile sites at all of our missile wings around the country, and then if the Soviets tried to send their missiles against ours, we could shoot them down as they in the higher atmosphere, and they wouldn't actually reach their targets. And the ABM, there were 2 ABM sites built, one in near Great Falls at Maelstrom, and one in North Dakota. This is the only one that ever came online. It was online for 4 months.
Can I say something about that?
Sure.
The ABM site was important when they were considering the deactivation of Grand Forks, because the issue was the 1972 ABM treaty said that both the Soviet Union and the United States could have one each ABM site. So you could have the capability, and again, this is theoretical, that you can actually shoot these suckers down coming in, but at any rate, that each side could have one site that would be anti-ballistic missile. It could be located at the nation's capital or at an ICBM field.
And the Soviets did theirs at Moscow.
Moscow. So the Soviets put it at Moscow. We had ours up by Grand Forks. Now that became important because then the interpretation, and there were varying degrees of interpretation here, is that if we deactivate the missile wing, then does that mean we can't have an ABM site there? Even though it wasn't operational by that time, but it gives the President and the Secretary of Defense the option to go back then and to say, well, we still want to build an ABM site. But now if you're not protecting an ICBM field...
What's it for?
What's it for?
Grand
and
Forks.
so that came into play.
So this is the Department of Defense photo of Nakoma. You've all seen that site. It cost $6 billion, and it was online for 4 months before our agreements with the Soviet Union required us to deactivate it. These are the 2 missile wings. Oh, go ahead. This is one being constructed. Go ahead. These are the actual locations of the ICBM silos. And here's another map of the Minot wing.
Now, in each one of these clusters you see, there's going to be one launch control center, and there's going to be 10 missiles at each one of these clusters. But they have secondary responsibility for 10 as well. So if one of and this is the whole redundancy thing. It cannot be vulnerable to anything. So if you figure out a way to knock out one launch control center, there's got to be still a way that you can launch those missiles.
So if Minot has 150 silos, there are 15 launch control centers?
Right.
Each one has 10.
There's 5 for each squadron.
Okay. Yeah. Here's the Grand Forks system. They've all been deactivated. The missiles have been pulled. The warheads have been deactivated, and then they have been imploded. The Department of Defense, the Air Force actually goes out and implodes those silos and fills them with rubble, and then does before and after satellite photographs of them so that we can confirm to the Soviet Union and China and others that we have in fact deactivated those silos.
Except for one. I mean, it's
The one we
deactivated,
went
but
to,
the
right.
one at Cooperstown.
We'll show that in a minute here.
Oh, you got that too?
This is a silo being built. Then we have, this is back to the Cold War footprint in North Dakota. We have the Omega Coast Guard antenna at Lemoore. Some of you have seen that. It was one of 9, Larry. There were 9 spread out all over the planet. And the way this worked is that it worked on extreme low frequency radio. And if you had 3 towers, there was one in France, there was another one in Norway. So if you have the one in Lemoore, North Dakota, and the one in Norway and the one in France, they're listening to ships and at extremely low frequency, and they can triangulate and they could pinpoint a ship within 4 nautical miles. So it was an early form of GPS. They have been made redundant and useless because of GPS, and that tower, which was built in 1971 in Lemoore, is no longer used for a Coast Guard purpose. It's now used for submarine extreme low frequency communications. But that was Milton R. Young was from Lemoore, and so he was able to get that
Purely
site.
a coincidence.
And here's the site and the tower. It was 1971 to 1997, but it still has a function. Then there were 2 radar bases from another wave of radar. These were meant to pick up planes that were coming from the Soviet Union. One of them was in Dickinson, my hometown. One of them was up near Arnegard. The other day I was in Dickinson yesterday, Larry, and I went up to Radar Base Hill. It's actually Davis Buttes, and I took some pictures. This is what it is today. It was a radar base until 1965. Then it was deactivated, and then it became a Job Corps site for a few years in Dickinson, and now it's just a heap of junk. There's a picture of one of the former antennas. There's one of the small facilities there. There are about 3,500 junked cars on top of this butte. It's a really shameful scar of the Cold War in North Dakota. These are beautiful buttes, and something should be done to remove all this crap from up there. It's really just junk. Here's a couple of the barracks and office complexes from the radar site. And this is a communications tower that's been put up there more recently by Consolidated Telephone. And there's the Davis Butte from Interstate 94. So that was once a radar base, and there was one at Arnegard. They were important sites, both now decommissioned. Some of you will remember uranium. The uranium craze in North Dakota, it appears to be coming back, or at least it was until last weekend in Japan. But there has been a lot of talk about reopening some of these uranium mines in Billings County and Stark County and Bowman. And then the interstate highway system. And I know you don't fully agree with this, but President Eisenhower partly sold the interstate highway system to Congress by saying that it would be an important for evacuation in the event of nuclear attack, for preparedness in the event of war with the Soviet Union. And so North Dakota got 2 interstate highways, I-94, 352 miles, and I-29. We were the first state to complete the interstate highway, and in fact, there was a 12-mile section between Jamestown and Valley City that was the first section ever made of the interstate highway system in the United States.
Why do you say I don't buy that?
Because you told me that. You think that was a piece of political rhetoric.
No.
What do you think?
What I said is that the interstate system is exactly the same thing as he saw in Germany with the Autobahn.
The Autobahn, right? And
he was just impressed. And you know, the military requirements to move troops and stuff, that's part of it. So I don't say that the nuclear issue wasn't part of it, but I don't know that that was the only part of it.
Fair enough.
That's all.
There's a picture of the whole system. There's Dwight Eisenhower selling the system. Here's the early construction of it, not that this matters very much. Now, let's get on to Cooperstown.
Okay.
So what have we done here? We've looked at the interstate highway. That's sort of a part of the Cold War in North Dakota, but it had multiple uses. It was also America's Autobahn and part of it, the development of our transportation infrastructure generally, and a work project. It's been called by some historians the last project of the New Deal. Then you have the 2 air bases, which continue to have a function in the 21st century in spite of the fact that the Cold War ended in 1991. You have the radar facilities that are gone. You have the Coast Guard Tower that's been morphed into a non-military 21st century application. So let's go to the legacy now for a moment before we take some questions. You were a missileer, and I had the great good fortune of traveling with you last year with some of our friends to Cooperstown. Can you talk a little bit about that site?
Actually, let's take a look at this picture here.
Okay.
And just to kind of
It's not a
explain.
very high res.
Can you see it?
It's pretty low res, but go ahead.
Yeah, it works out though. I know this is not going to look good, but I'm going to stand up. Scott, I'm sorry. Scott's filming this. He's going, let's kind of take a look at this and see if I can, I'm going to step down here. I know this is highly unusual, but. Okay, what we have here is a launch control center. The launch control centers are underground. This is very typical. They didn't all look like this, and so there are some variations to this, but all the ones that I served in Wyoming and Missouri look just like this, so I understand this system a little bit better than some of the others, but they're just small variations to it. Up here is a support building, and the support building houses security folks, because the ICBMs are out there, the Minuteman missiles are out there all by themselves. There's a fence around it and there's an alarm system to it. So the people that actually respond to that when an alarm goes off live here. They're stationed out here probably, I don't know what it is today, I've been out of the business for a while, but I think they spent about 4 days out there. And then whenever there was an alarm, they would rush off to go check out the alarm. There'd be some maintenance people out there. There was a cook out there. And I do not want to besmirch all the cooks in the Air Force, but I got to tell you this one quick story. You're down here, you're working down here, okay? You're dependent on these guys for food. And so you would order the food, they bring it down an elevator, and they let you know it's down there. You open the blast door, you go out to get your food. It was kind of like feeding time at a zoo, By the time you got the blast door open, the cook would be gone and back upstairs, and there'd be a tray sitting there on the floor with your food on it. And I thought, okay, well, I'll try this. And they gave you little menus, and so I'd order this, and it was terrible. And so then I said, well, I'll try something else, and it was terrible. And finally, and this was one particular cook, by the way, so every time I went out there, I checked who was cooking, and I thought, oh man, this is terrible. So one time I said, I know one thing he cannot mess up. So I ordered a peanut butter sandwich. And I opened the blast door, and I'll explain how you do that, but I opened the blast door, I walked out there was a tray. There was 2 slices of bread on the tray, a jar of peanut butter, and a knife stuck in it. So at any rate, okay, so anyway, all of this is the support up here, what you see, and then there's elevators that go down, and then you've got the launch control center, and then you've got the support building. What this is what brings the air in. One's an exhaust and one's an intake, and it brings air down so that and these are all computerized down here, so it stays. You've got to keep the air conditioning running all the time. So you've got an air conditioner over here that's running and pumping cool air into this system all the time. It's bringing air in. It's doing all that exchange. There's a diesel over here. You're on commercial power, but if you lost commercial power, then it would switch over to diesel. And so the diesel would come on. And all this is redundant. All of this stuff's going on is redundant. So at any rate, all that support mechanism is here. Over here, this is what you are doing. There's 2 of you that are on alert at all times. And so the 2 of you are downstairs there, and there's a bed. You can rack out. You take turns. You're down there for 24 hours at a time unless there's a big snowstorm and people can't come out. And then you might be down there for 48 hours or until somebody gets you down there. And then this was the escape hatch. Again, this was theory. The thought was that if there was a nuclear explosion here, it would probably wipe out the support building up here. And so somebody came up with a harebrained idea that the crew members are going to want to get out. So they dug this thing that comes up within like 2 feet of the ground, and then they filled it full of sand. And then there was a big door on it, and we used to call it, that was a deputy function. You had a commander and a deputy. The deputy was going to have to go up there and turn that big bolt to let all that sand down, because it would probably kill him. And then you were supposed to climb up here, and then there was a little shovel set up here, and then you were supposed to dig your way out. I mean, it was an absurd notion, to say the least.
But it beats the alternative. That's your only way out if the system is taken out.
So then what we've got up here, they're showing, and I really wanted to explain what's going on up here. These were called ALCS, the Airborne Launch Control System. And so you've got 5 of these in a squadron, 5 of these that are actually the launch control centers down here, and they're going to turn keys. People talk about a push-button war, but it was actually a turn key. You had 2 keys, and both keys have to go in, and they have to be turned within like 2 seconds of each other, and then that creates a vote, it's called, and then that vote goes out to the missiles and says, okay, we've got to launch, but then another vote has to come out, so not one crew someplace can decide to turn keys and see what's going to happen. And so someplace else, these other guys, then they have to turn, and now you've got 2 votes going out there, and it doesn't respond unless it gets 2 votes. Well, imagine if there had been this Pearl Harbor sneak attack, and now you have only 1 site left, maybe, because 4 of them have been wiped out. So then another vote could come in from the air launch control system. So they would be flying over, and then they would send down, and through that antenna would come that vote, and that would go in the systems, and the missiles would get their vote. And I could go on, there's a lot more about this, but I don't know. Any questions when you see the diagram?
How many people would have been involved at that site?
At this site, okay, you've got 2
Repeat
down
the
here.
question.
I'm sorry, the question was how many people would actually be at the site? You're going to have 2 crew members down here. You're going to have 1 flight controller that's going to be up here in this part of the building, and he's the one that responds to all the alarms, all the notice comes to him and stuff. He's going to have a fire team there. Today, I don't know, I think there were probably 4 or 5 on a fire team that would also have been up there. There's going to be a cook, and then there's going to be an FM, a facility manager, and he or she was a senior NCO, and they sort of were the adult supervision on the top side. Because you've got all these young cops, and then there would be extra spare bedrooms down there, so if you had maintenance people that came out and worked on a site and it got late at night, they would come and they would stay there. Now, we did have one thing to tell. Minot's had 3 big problems lately.
There was another question, though.
I'm sorry. What'd you do about boredom? I read a lot of history books. Once you went down there, you would go down, and then you had a checklist you went through every day, every time you took over an alert, because it's all a very complex machine. And so you had a checklist. You'd start off, you would go down the elevator. Well, I'll tell you about that. When you showed up as a crew, you would show up outside the gate here. You would radio in to the flight controller, to the security controller. You would pass a code. They would know that you're legit. They would let you on site. You would come in. That person would check your ID and all that sort of stuff. You'd get on an elevator, and then you would go down here, and then they had headphones, and then you would talk to the crew inside, and they would know that you're downstairs, and then you would go in here and you would inspect all of this equipment to make sure it's all running like it's supposed to, and all the oil levels are right, and everything's running just like it's supposed to. Then you would go in, and then you would put on the headphone, and you would call these guys again, tell them you're ready. And then there's this huge blast door. It's a very small area. It's about that high, but it's a huge blast door, and I'm sure someplace it tells you how much it weighs. And it's got big pins in it, and it's hydraulic, and they call it pumping pins. And so when it's closed, when that door is closed, those pins, and they go all the way around that door, those pins actually seat into the frame. And again, they're about that big around, and they're seated into the frame. So anyway, they would pump those pins, which means they would bring them back in, and then they could open that big blast door, and then the 2 of you would come in. So now there would be 4 people in here, close the blast door again, and then the 4 of you would do a changeover briefing and inspect some of the stuff while they were still there. Then you would take over, you would sign, and when you signed, you took over control of the alert. And then you would pump those pins, and those 2 guys would go out. I keep saying guys because most of the time I was in, it was all men in Minuteman, and that only changed fairly recently. And then those 2 would leave. They'd go up the elevator. They would head for home, and then the 2 of you would be down here. You inspected everything. You had a checklist to inspect everything again, make sure all the computers are working. You might send some tests out to some of the missiles and get a response back. So you're doing all that, and all of this is about 2 hours of your day. Now you got 22 hours to sit there till somebody relieves you. And so what I did is I worked on my master's degree in history and sat down there and I just read history books and wrote a lot of papers. And most of the missileers I know worked on graduate programs while they were down there because it's not really exciting. Okay, Minot's had three big problems relative to nuclear weaponry. Number one is they flew some air-launched control missiles, air-launched cruise missiles with nuclear bombs on them to Barksdale, Louisiana, and didn't know they had them. Okay, and they parked down there. That was a big, big issue. I'm sure you all remember reading the newspapers about that. Okay, that wasn't supposed to happen. Then they had components from nuclear weapons system. Now, when you say components, that doesn't mean it's nuclear stuff. That doesn't mean it, but somehow it ties into the system. Okay, and they had components, and they flew those to Taiwan and didn't know that. And then the other one was the theft of what they called nuclear components by, wasn't it? Oh no, there was four. Because then there was the theft of a nuclear component, and this guy admitted to it, and then they let him resign instead of court-martialing him. Okay, let me explain what that is. All nuclear weapons and all components of nuclear weapons have to be controlled by two people at all times. Just period. Two people have to always control them. Well, you've only got two people down here. That means one person's going to sleep because you're down there for 24 hours. So there is a mechanism to identify whether or not any of those components have been tampered with while you're sleeping. That's the bottom line to it. So these pieces that this guy took as a souvenir was nothing but a seal that goes on this equipment, so you would know, for example, if somebody opened up a computer, you would know that because that seal would be broken. And what happened is this one officer decided he was going to keep them as a souvenir. Not a good idea. The other thing that happened is they did what's called a code change. All the communications with the weapon systems done by codes. Okay? And I don't even understand that. Okay? I'm an operator. I don't understand what that means, but basically it means that somehow there's a cipher, let's say, that actually communicates with the system. And that cipher gets changed out every now and then. And what happened was you got to have control of that by two people at all times, and they had two crews, so they had four people in control of this cipher, and they went upstairs here, and three of them went to sleep, which meant you had one person in charge, or you had one person in control of this code. And that created all sorts of problems for them. So they've had some real problems. Now I'm going to give you my theory about what happened here. In 1992, the Strategic Air Command was inactivated. And up to that point, the Air Force, Curtis LeMay had created an Air Force in the Air Force. You had the United States Air Force, and a big piece of that inside was the Strategic Air Command. And that Strategic Air Command controlled all the nuclear weapons. And there was absolutely no room for error, none. And so what happened in the Strategic Air Command environment is everybody was really high level, under a lot of pressure, never to make a mistake. In fact, our training facilities in Strategic Air Command, you would go into them, and the symbol for the Strategic Air Command is a mailed fist, like a knight would have, you know, that metal glove. And this hand had a hold of a turnip, and squeezing the turnip, and blood coming out of it. And it said, "The hell we can't." So the Strategic Air Command was really intense on this, and they would get blood out of a turnip, okay? And they were really intense on it. And in 1992, the Strategic Air Command was inactivated. And these components were just kind of passed, by components, units. Units within the Air Force now were kind of passed around. Some ended up in this command, some ended up in that command. They lost track of what was going on. The the level of anxiety that those of us that were old SAC people felt was just gone for whatever reason. That's what I think happened. And I more think that's happened because what the Air Force did after these 4 incidents as Minot is they stood up now what's called the Air Force Global Strike Command, which as far as I'm concerned means they stood up a new SAC. And they put the nuclear weapons in there, and they're bringing some focus back to nuclear weapons. And so I'm hopeful that that's going to solve the problems. And everything I've read, it appears that it has. Now, I'm going to tell you just one quick story, and then we'll go back to this. One quick story about why I think it happened. As I mentioned before, if you wanted to become Chief of Staff of the Air Force, you had to somehow, usually, generally speaking, go through SAC. You were at some point going to have to be a command in SAC. And Dick Cheney, during the first Gulf War, fired the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, a guy by the name of General Dugan. And if you go out in line and you read about it, you find out that they said that he spoke openly against the war effort or something. That's not true. He went to the Middle East and he flew in a fighter. And he went there and he flew when he wasn't supposed to, because it was in combat and he was Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So when Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense, found out that he did that, he called him back to his office and fired him. Well, then they had to scramble to come up with a Chief of Staff of the Air Force. They appointed an interim, General Lowe, and they ended up they ended up appointing a guy by the name of General McPeak. And General McPeak had never been through SAC. He is a fighter guy his whole career, and it was obvious to us that we're in that he did not like SAC. So when he took over, he deactivated it. He stood up an ACC, an Air Combat Command, in its place, and then shredded out pieces of nuclear around, and I think it was a terrible mistake. And I think what we've seen at Minot has been a result of that terrible mistake by this guy. And at any rate, I know that's political, but it is tied directly to North Dakota because of the Strategic Air Command. So in 1992, the Strategic Air Command was gone from Grand Forks and Minot.
And they have been sort of mission shopping since to try to stay open. And there are periodic base closing commissions, and they've both had near misses, and Grand Forks probably can't survive many more years.
Yeah, they're UAVs now.
What's a UAV?
Unmanned aerial vehicle.
And when you say stood up, not everyone knows that term. What do you mean by it?
Which one?
When you say we stood up this.
Oh, well, what happened is they deactivated. That means they took apart the Strategic Air Command and they created a new command called the Air Combat Command.
That's standing it up.
Standing up.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah. Just, I mean, I know the jargon is very deep into the system, but most of us don't know it.
Got it.
So, okay, so have you explained your
I've
schematic
explained
diagram
enough. I've
here?
explained enough.
But let me ask you some questions about this.
Okay.
And we need to quit and we need to ask the audience. But Larry, you spent how many years going up and down into these facilities?
Well, actually involved in running this weapon system about 7 years.
So you spent a lot of time down below the surface of the earth, behind this blast door. And so you have a lot of experience about this. And you wrote...
Well, I will say I didn't spend near as much time as most of them do, because I ended up in, this probably is irrelevant here, but I ended up in what was called division training, and then I went into division standardization and evaluation, so they were kind of administrative jobs. So I did this, but I didn't go down. Most crew members do this, think about this, 8 times a month. 8 times a month they're going down. So you add that, that's 16 days of actually being underground. And I did 2 to 4 times a month. So I didn't spend as much time as most crew members.
And so the Minot wing is still in place, but the Grand Forks wing has been deactivated, and out of the 150 silos, 149 have been imploded, but 1 remains. Can you explain our trip to Cooperstown?
Well, I think the Heritage Center does it, North Dakota Heritage Center. One of them, one site up at Cooperstown was preserved, And when we say preserved, it was preserved. They have, it's just, when I walked in there, it was just like walking into one that's
That they just walked out of and left the
that
way
they
it
just
was.
walked out. In fact, it was really funny. The boss, when when I retired, I was the Inspector General at Francis E. Warren, and the guy that was my boss there was the Vice Wing Commander, was a guy by the name of Ed Rausch. And I walked into that facility, and there his picture was on the wall because he'd been the Inspector General at Grand Forks. And his picture is still there. And so they just turned around and walked out. And so the Heritage Center has done a marvelous job of preserving it. And if you have not been there, you really need to go look at this.
Is this the pointer?
Yep.
So if you go to this is near Cooperstown, where Larry also taught school at one point, and you go into this facility, and you get a little orientation, and you get to see it, and it's all sort of 1970s paneling, and they have, on the tables, they have Monopoly and Risk and Scrabble, and there are puzzles, and it looks like they just left, and there's artwork on the walls and so on. And then after your orientation, you go down in this elevator, down what you said these two people do, and you go in, and I think on our tour there were 7 or 8 of us, but they can probably take several times that. And then you get to look around. You get to see where the cot, the bed is, and where the actual consoles are, and the 2 keys are 12 feet apart so that no one person could ever do both keys at once. And you get a very interesting, bona fide, as it was, tour of an actual complex. And then you could drive, after we spent about an hour there, then we drove over to the actual missile site, right? That's a couple of miles away. This is controlled by the State Historical Society of North Dakota. It's one of 2. In South Dakota, from the Ellsworth wing, there is one that is managed by the National Park Service, and near Phillips, South Dakota, and the one in North Dakota is at Cooperstown. It's run by the state. But have any of you been there? It is absolutely worth going to see it. It's a tremendous thing that we've done this, because the Cold War has played such an important part in the history of North Dakota since World War II. And at some point this will all be gone. Probably when my daughter is an adult, there won't be a nuclear presence in North Dakota any longer. There won't be one at Grand Forks. And now to have a facility here where we have actually preserved the history of this incredibly important chapter in North Dakota life is wonderful. So if you get a chance, they're not open through the winter, I don't think, but you can go out there. Do you have any other thoughts about our day at the Cooperstown facility?
I think, should we?
Yeah, we're going to ask, there's the ABM side. I just want to go to the legacy part of this for just 1 minute.
Okay.
So what's the legacy of this? We have 150 missiles still in the ground in North Dakota. We have 2 air bases still in North Dakota. You probably know that at Lemoore, Senator Young got that's an ICBM Minuteman I, right?
That is, yes.
And it's still there in Lemoore, and there's a commemorative marker to him there. That's one piece of this. Here's the Oscar Zero site at Cooperstown that Larry and I went to. That's the building you saw on the schematic. This is the console.
This is the Commander's Council.
And it's kind of like a Star Trek chair there, Larry. And there's a teletype. Where's the teletype?
Oh, that's over by the Deputy's Council. You don't have a picture of that here.
I don't think so. Okay, go ahead.
This is funny.
You said the clenched fist. This is another form of Air Force humor.
Yeah. This is SAC humor right here. Time on target for ICBMs was, give or take a couple minutes, 30 minutes. Now, here's one of the things that I would like to explore before we turn it over to questions,
Certainly.
Clay. Is according to the United States Constitution, only Congress can declare war. But all of you have heard that the president carries around the football. Somebody follows him with the football, and the football has the codes to release nuclear weapons. So what happens if the president gets a call from NORAD, let's say, from Colorado Springs, and is told, his men are told, men and women, his advisors are told that the Soviets have launched an attack on us. Now think how devastating nuclear weapons can be. Think how devastating a nuclear war would be. Now, is the President of the United States going to call Congress together now to decide whether or not he's going to have a war with the Soviet Union? No, I think the President of the United States is going to make a decision at that point in time, and let's just assume that he gets notified and he takes 15 minutes to talk to his Secretary of Defense. They tell him we've got 50, if he would get notified, they would have about 15 minutes before impact from the time they receive notification. So he's been notified, 15 minutes to impact. He's got to decide whether or not to launch.
1, 10, or 1,000. He can do whatever he wants.
1, 10, or 1,000. And I just wonder what this has done to the United States Constitution and to the congressional oversight, particularly relative to the declaration of war. What do you think?
Well, we know the answer to this, that every war since the nuclear age has been initiated by the executive. And with the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, for example, Lyndon Johnson got some sort of a congressional mandate. So did George W. Bush for the Gulf War too. But essentially, the nature of modern weaponry is instantaneous, 30 minutes or less. And so the president is forced into a position that the Founding Fathers didn't intend for him or her, because there's no time to consult Congress in events like this. And so this is Gary Will's thesis. In Gary Will's book, Bomb Power, his argument is that the creation of nuclear weaponry is not just about nuclear weaponry. It created a new protocol about how wars will be thought of and fought and strategized, and it gave the executive of the United States infinite power compared to what the Founding Fathers had in mind. In Jefferson's time, if the Barbary pirates are giving you fits over in North Africa, you call Congress together, they debate it for a while, there's nothing much at stake, eventually you send a squadron over there. The pace of warfare and the nature of weaponry was such at the beginning of our history that this was feasible. But beginning with World War II, with Hitler's reign of terror on London and the strategic bombing that followed against Germany, warfare became much faster. And then when you add missiles, it became virtually instantaneous. And so now you have effectively dealt out the Congress of the United States, whether you're a Jeffersonian or not, that the sheer reality of modern warfare forces the president to have powers that were not intended by our Republican system of government. So that's the neutral side of it, that this is inevitable. The dark side of this is that presidents have been glad to have this advantage and have used it even when they didn't need to. And so that presidents have aggrandized themselves, and without being political even for a second, George W. Bush, the most recent president before the current one, developed a whole theory of the unitary presidency and said that given the nature of terrorism in the post-9/11 world and the weaponry of our time, the president not only is forced to have this power, but it's good that he has this power, and this effectively ends congressional oversight in certain ways, including on questions of surveillance, on questions of arrests without habeas corpus, and so on. I don't mean any political statement by that. That's just the nature of the argument that was made by the Bush administration, that too much is at stake to go through 18th century constitutional norms in the new reality of the 21st century. And so Gary Will's argument is that this was born in the Manhattan Project, and whether we like it or not, it permanently changes the nature of our Constitution.
And it's a humbling thought, I think, that this power to unleash everything we've talked about today, the power to unleash all of this, has resided in one person.
The president. Since 1945.
Since 1945.
But Larry, just to wrap up,
yeah.
Here's North Dakota, this agrarian farm state. I mean, if ever there was a purely agrarian place, it has been North Dakota. Why did we become the front line of the Cold War? Two reasons, really. One is that we are closer to the North Pole than Florida, and because of that, it made sense to put bases here for B-52s and an ABM site here and missiles here, because the distance between us and targets is much smaller here than it would be even in Nebraska. So that's one reason. The second reason is that we lobbied for it, that Senator Young said, hey, we deserve some of this largesse, this government largesse that's coming in the wake of the Cold War. If you're going to put it somewhere, and North Dakota is one of several states that has no facilities, why not put them here? One could argue that there's a third argument, that our diffused population and our very low population means that from a strategic point of view, it makes more sense to have these critical facilities on the prairie than it would, say, on Long Island or in Los Angeles, because if all those missiles rained down on North Dakota, you would kill 700,000 people, but if they rained down on San Diego, you would kill 7 million people.
And just one last thought about this, and we'll see if there's any questions, and we'll call it a day here. Minot Air Force Base released their economic impact study here just last month. It's over $500 million. That's what Minot Air Force Base means to Minot
Per
and
annum?
to North Dakota.
Per annum or total? 500 million per year?
Well,
It's going to make a big difference.
it can't be total, Clay.
Well, then it's $500 million per year of economic activity. That's gigantic, because the Farm Bill brings in about $2 billion per year.
So, are there any questions? We got a microphone, and we do need Robin to get it.
Okay. And could we have you stand up?
That is 1 year. I want to, according to Lieutenant Colonel Barry Edens, 5th Comptroller Squadron Commander, the fiscal year total annual economic impact is estimated at $513 million.
So that's why we cling to these, even though their mission is no longer as central as it once was.
Larry, you mentioned at the end you were involved in training. I'm curious how much ethical training or psychological testing went into a budding missileer, and could Clay pass that test?
I will tell you this, and it's been a long time ago. I went through the school 30-some years ago. But one of the things they did, which was really stark, when I got to Vandenberg Air Force Base, our very first day of class, they brought us all in. I don't know, there was probably 30 of us in the class or something like that. And they brought us into this little auditorium, just a small auditorium, and we sat down, and they showed us a movie for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, half hour maybe, of the effects of nuclear war. And they had all those classic pictures you've seen where the buildings are just wiped out, and they showed the mushrooms, and the picture that Clay showed, they showed the people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and you're just sitting there watching this thing. It's a 21 kiloton bomb did this, and it was exploded at 1,500 feet and all this sort of stuff. And when they got all done, they passed out a sheet of paper. And that sheet of paper said on it that I understand the consequences of this weapon system, and I'm willing to accept that. And one guy in our group refused to sign it, and he was gone the next day. And so, I don't know that there was a lot of psychological testing, but boy, that was a real psychological impact statement.
I have a very narrow focus question. I live in Mayville, Portland, and in between roughly Cooperstown and Mayville, Portland is Findlay, and I wondered if you noticed or knew if the abandoned Air Force radar base there had a part in this mission.
I don't know, what was it doing?
Well, there were a bunch of other radar facilities in North Dakota. We were just talking about the main ones, but that was a support structure for the Grand Forks Air Force Base. I don't know whether it's what's being done with it now. It's abandoned
now,
okay.
yeah. Okay.
So one of the things that, we're going back to those slides I showed of Davis Butte in Dickinson with the former radar base, there's a lot of Cold War debris in North Dakota spread out all over. And it would make sense to me that we would go reclaim that at some point. It's a shame to see the top of that beautiful butte in such disarray. It's been privatized, people own it, there are storage facilities up there, porta potties, it's become a junkyard for former cars. There are radar facilities, including near Minot, that have just been sitting there for years, and you would think that there would be a national, not a state, but a national movement to go reclaim those facilities, because you want to keep some of it as museum pieces, but a lot of it is just rusted out junk, and it leads to a certain culture. You know, my mother and I were up on this butte yesterday in Dickinson, and she hadn't been up there for 40 years, and so we drove up, and it was really just a mess, a terrible, awful thing. But there were 3 prefab houses of people actually living up there, and surrounded by just rusted out hulks and so on, and the whole thing had a very unpleasant feel to it, and it would seem to me that this sort of thing is all over the state because of this.